Um, Thank you so much to everyone for being with us tonight. My name is Kendra Field, and on behalf of the Du Bois Freedom Center, it's such a pleasure to welcome Dr. Carrie Greenidge here to speak about her phenomenal new book, The Grimke's, The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family. Tonight's talk has been made possible in part by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Sustaining Humanities through the American Rescue Plan in partnership with the American Historical Association. I'd also like to thank, before we begin, Jenny Sills, Zoe Schoen, and the entire board of the Du Bois Freedom Center for making events like these possible. Tonight's program is a real treat. It will last 1 hour. We will be succinct. And after my introduction, Dr. Greenidge will speak about her latest book. And then we will really look forward to conversation and questions and answers from the audience. You can place your questions into the Q&A area, and you can do so during or after, but I encourage you to generate those questions as we get going. All right. Dr. Carrie Greenidge is the Mellon Assistant Professor in the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University. She's the author of Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter. Listed by the New York Times as one of its top picks of 2019, the book is the first biography of Boston newspaper editor William Monroe Trotter, written in nearly 50 years. The book received the Mark Linton Prize in History, the Massachusetts Book Award, the J. Anthony Lucas Award, the Sperber Award, and the Peter Gomes Book Prize from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Black Radical was also shortlisted for the Stone Book Award, the Kundal History Prize, and the Plutarch Award for Best Biography. Her latest book, The Grimke's, just came out a couple months ago and has since been named one of the New York Times Book Review's 100 Notable Books of 2022, Publishers Weekly's 10 Best Books of the Year, and among the best books by NPR, Oprah Daily, Smithsonian, the Boston Globe, and the Chicago Public Library. Dr. Greenidge's writings have appeared in the Massachusetts Historical Review, the Radical History Review, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Guardian. And she's also had a rich career in public history, from her early work for the National Park Service and the founding of Tufts African American Trail Project, to currently serving as project historian for the Museum of African American History in Boston. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much, Dr. Greenidge.
Thank you so much for having me, everybody. And we can start with the first slide. So I want to begin just by saying thank you to you, Jenny Sills, Frances Jones Sneed, all the members of the board at the Du Bois Freedom Center, and to to Zoe Schoen for handling the technical difficulties, and of course to my colleague, Dr. Kendra Field. So I'm going to do a brief talk that situates the Grimke family and their legacy within the context of the book, but also their connection to the history of African Americans in the Berkshires. And then I'm going to open it up for questions after kind of introducing the genesis, the ideas behind the book. So if we can go to the first slide, there we go. I will begin. So next slide. Throughout her life, the woman you see here, Charlotte Forten Grimke, found solace and restoration in the Berkshires. The daughter of Philadelphia sailmaker and abolitionist James Forten, Charlotte, called Lottie, was the first Black woman graduate of a state normal school, that was a teaching school, the first Black woman to teach in a predominantly white institution, and the first Black person published in the prestigious Atlantic Monthly magazine. In the midst of her accomplishments, however, Lottie Forten was also an often neglected daughter of her widowed and financially struggling father, who spent much of her adolescence recovering from various illnesses at various water cure facilities in Northampton. Although Great Barrington was over 60 miles east of Northampton, as we all know, Lottie spent extensive time in the Berkshires during her convalescence in Northampton. In 1856, for instance, she wrote in her diary about, quote, bumpy carriage rides with the bees in Great Barrington after a 3-day journey from the water cure in Northampton. In 1860 as well, she remarked that, quote, Great Barrington might provide sojourn, end quote, as she recovered from pneumonia at a friend's house in Pittsfield. Lottie Forten's statements provide more questions than answers about the relationship between the Fortens, antebellum America's most famous Black abolitionist family, and the small yet apparently significant, quote, colored community, this is the term they use for themselves, of Great Barrington. For instance, were the B's that she referred to part of the Burgart family that produced the region's most famous Black resident, W.E.B. Du Bois, in 1868? Were some of the quote unquote colored people that Lottie Fortin refers to part of the Black family and kin who helped create Clinton Church after the Civil War, decades after Lottie Fortin visited the area in the 1860s? We don't know these at this point. And although further study is needed to determine the precise connection between Great Barrington's Black community and Lottie Fortin and her abolitionist circle, this area, Great Barrington, neighboring Lee and Lenox, and the Berkshire region more generally, loomed large in the lives of Black intellectuals, activists, and artists during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Indeed, long before James Weldon Johnson's writing cabin, the Berkshires provided solace to Lottie Fortin and to many of her family and kin. Go to the next slide. This here, James Vanderzee, picture of Black people in Lenox in 1905. During the 1890s, for instance, around the time, a decade or so after this photograph was taken, Lottie's niece, Angelina Weld Grimke, spent many summers in Stockbridge with a, quote, colored family, end quote, that she refers to as the H's. She mentions, in fact, that she wrote, quote, many little poetic jottings while lounging on the steps of, quote, the H's narrow porch overlooking the mountains. Again, we don't know which house or which family she was referring to. You can go to the next slide. When Angelina Weld Grimke, called Nana, wrote these words in 1913, she was living and working in DC. Yet her heart, as she put it, quote, belongs more and more to New England, end quote. Nana was the daughter of Archibald Henry Grimke, Lottie Fortin's brother-in-law. In 1878, Lottie married Francis James Grimke, minister of DC's 15th Street Presbyterian Church, the most significant elite Black institution of its time. The fact that Black people have always been present in the Berkshires should come as no surprise to any student of African-American history or to the audience here this evening. As Lottie Fortin put it in 1876, quote, the colored people are everywhere. The sooner the whites realize this, she concluded, the better we all will be. Yet, as we study, honor, and preserve this history, we must also reflect upon the nuances of color, class, and place that shape it. The legacies of slavery, of Black women's sexual exploitation by slaveholding white men, and of relentless white violence punctuated by glimmers of white paternalism, all of these force us to see the Black presence in the Berkshires, like Blackness everywhere, as more complicated than tales of racial exceptionalism might first allow us to think. The story of the Grimke family in particular indicates the significance of these legacies as we seek a more complex understanding of Blackness in Great Barrington, and of course, Blackness more generally. So I will begin with a short story and then open it up for questions. So in the fall of 1906, when she was 26 years old, around the time that this image was taken, Angelina Weld Grimke arrived in Charleston, far from Great Barrington, in South Carolina for the first time. The occasion was the 40th anniversary of the Avery Institute, the first accredited secondary school for Black people in Charleston. Originally called the Tappan School, Avery's first principals were free Black brothers, Thomas and Francis Cardozo. The Cardozos, by the way, have a link to the Berkshires as well, which I can talk about in the Q&A. The Cardozos were descended from those who Angelina's grandmother, Nancy Weston, referred to as, quote, colored Westons. By this, she meant an influential web of family and kin who led Charleston's free Black artisan class in the decades before the Civil War. You can go to the next slide. Go to the next one. Grandmother Nancy Weston was not free until Union troops reclaimed Charleston in 1865, which meant that her own three sons, under the slave law of partus sequitur ventrum, were enslaved. Still, she raised them, Angelina's father and her uncle, and their little brother John, to believe in the exceptionalism of this antebellum free Black community. The greatest blood of the South flows through your veins, she often told the boys during those long ago days in their one-room house on Cumming Street in Charleston. And by this, she meant not only, quote, the colored Westons, but the white Grimke family who claimed to own them. The quote unquote colored Westons helped found Avery Institute in 1866. And now, 40 years later, in 1906, Angelina's father and uncle returned to Charleston as the most famous Grimkes in the country to congratulate the Avery Institute's graduating class of newly minted Black teachers. That spring in 1906, however, As Angelina spent the days after Avery's graduation touring the city, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that remained unsaid behind the pomp and circumstance of the Avery ceremony. One of the most concerning things for Angelina was the fact that she saw little evidence of the white Grimkes, the source of that supposed quote unquote great blood of the South, whose exceptionalism once sat on the South Carolina Supreme Court and in the Charleston mayor's office. The only public indication of the white Grimke's past accomplishments was a peeling sign, she called it Grimke's haberdashery, in what she felt were loud whispers amongst a group of Black women who whispered about the state of the old Grimke mansion on East Bay Street. By the time she returned to her own home with Archie and Uncle Frank in Washington, D.C., Angelina couldn't help but feel, as she called it, a sense of foreboding. As she wrote to her Cardozo cousin in Great Barrington, "There is a tale there to tell indeed," she said. "Alas, I will never decipher it, although it sweeps over me heavily. How I wish," she concluded, "I had a mother to tell me what I want to know." When Angelina Weld Grimke took that trip to Charleston in 1906, the Grimke name was well known amongst members of what Du Bois called the talented 10th. Angelina's father, Archibald Henry Grimke, was a graduate of Harvard Law School, a successful attorney, a newspaper editor, and a political appointee who led the Black political independence movement during the 1880s. He was also a good friend of Du Bois's and of William Monroe Trotter's. You can go to the next slide. By 1906, Archibald, called Archie, had served as consul to the Dominican Republic under Democratic President Grover Cleveland, and founded DC's prestigious American Negro Academy with his friend Du Bois and Alexander Crummell. Her uncle, Francis James Grimke, called Frank, and Frank's wife, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, were equally accomplished. Frank was a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary. He was pastor of DC's exclusive 15th Street Presbyterian Church, and he was an investor in real estate and in property throughout Washington, D.C. and Maryland. Despite such pedigree, Nana Grimke remained privately haunted by the unanswered questions about her family's past. Questions that lingered in that worn Grimke's haberdashery sign and that deteriorating East Bay Street mansion in Charleston. As she told her friend Meta Fuller, soon after her return to DC, quote, "There is so much we do not know about the old slave times, and I fear that this will be our albatross. We are lost in a way," she concluded, "the future leaders of the colored race," end quote. So when I first started working on the Grimkes, the legacy of slavery in an American family, Nana Grimke's words shaped my approach to understanding this family's long, complicated, and ultimately uncomfortably familiar story. And I argue it should shape our approach to dissecting the Black history of Great Barrington. Like many African Americans at the turn of the last century, particularly the so-called colored elite in cities like DC, Philadelphia, and Boston, Nana Grimke was the granddaughter of both the enslaved and the enslaver. Yet she was also the grandniece of two of antebellum America's most famous white women reformers. You can go to the next slide. Sarah Grimke and Angelina Grimke Weld, who you see here, were two of 13 children born to one of the wealthiest and most politically influential slaveholding families in the South Carolina Lowcountry. During the 1830s, the sisters earned acclaim amongst New England's anti-slavery leaders for daring to speak publicly against the quote-unquote peculiar institution in which they'd been raised. In fact, Sarah's 1838 treatise, Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and the Condition of Women, and Angelina's An Appeal to the Christian Women of the South, became canonical texts in the anti-slavery and women's rights movements. In 1838, after nearly a year of touring the North, speaking on the duties of white women in public reform, Angelina Grimke became the first American-born woman to speak before a state government when she addressed the Massachusetts state legislature on the need for immediate emancipation and women's right to political representation. After Angelina married the radical anti-slavery activist Theodore Dwight Weld, you can go to the next slide. Their sisters, the next one. The sisters moved to rural New Jersey, where they raised Angelina's children, where they ran a series of reform-oriented and integrated schools for children of the abolitionist movement, and where they continued to host women's rights activists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Known as, quote, the first founders of women's rights, according to their 1970s biographer, the feminist Gerda Lerner, the Grimke sisters were lauded by their contemporaries for supposedly, quote, disavowing their birthright and sacrificing their wealth to support, quote, the cause of the slave. These are the facts that we know about the Grimkes. The accomplished Black Grimke brothers, Archie and Frank, who led Black America at the turn of the last century. Archie's daughter, Angelina, who became a brilliant poet, playwright, and one of the first Black women to produce and write her own stage performance. And the selfless and uncompromising women's rights activists, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, whose lives have inspired one novel, numerous historical monographs, and seats of honor in national and local women's rights museums across the country. And yet, as Nana Grimke pointed out in 1906, after her visit to the Avery Institute in Charleston, there is more of a, quote, tale there than historians and the general public have previously acknowledged. You can go to the next slide. How was it, for instance, that Angelina and Sarah Grimke professed horror and, quote, feelings of deception, end quote, when they discovered their Black nephews while reading an article in the National Anti-Slavery Standard in 1868? According to the Grimke sisters, and repeated by countless historians ever since, they first read about Archie and Frank in an article about Lincoln University, the Black college located in rural Pennsylvania that the brothers attended after the Civil War. According to Angelina, she and Sarah were, quote, horrified to discover that their brother, Henry Grimke, fathered 3 boys with his enslaved nurse, Nancy Weston. It was this horror, or so the story went, that led them to meet the brothers, to welcome them into their home in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, and to eventually help pay for their education at Lincoln and Archie's tuition to Harvard Law School. As a child, however, Nana Grimke often questioned this story. According to all the available historical evidence, of course, Nana's questions have merit. Henry Grimke, for instance, the boy's father, was a particularly brutal and sadistic slaveholder. You can go to the next slide. In fact, as I was doing research for this book, I found that the family talked frequently to one another's and to others outside of the family circle about the fact that Henry Grimke was particularly violent and sadistic. As a child, he delighted in banging slave boys' heads against door jambs. He caused one enslaved man, Stephen, permanent brain damage that was so severe, the Grimke sisters actually purchased him and brought him to New Jersey in the 1840s. In none of their letters, however, where they talk about their family history and their quote unquote obligation to their Black nephews, do they mention the fact that their mother, Nancy, was subject to similar abuse at the hands of Henry. Then there was the matter of the Grimke brothers themselves, men who ascended the ranks of the talented 10th only to reveal in private letters, diaries, and public speeches their disdain for those they referred to as, quote, the Negro masses, end quote. Raised by their mother, Nancy, to see themselves as exceptional, to believe that they were, quote, colored Westons, and that, quote, the greatest blood of the South flowed through their veins. Both Frank and Archie used the same derogatory language that Sarah and Angelina used when talking about, quote, the lowly slave, to describe what the brothers saw as the, quote, creeping immorality and, quote, looming irrespectability of those they called the majority of our colored people, end quote. As pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, for instance, Frank transformed the institution founded by John F. Cook in 1841 from a welcoming congregation of, quote, all classes of colored people into a bastion of postbellum color politics, to use the term of one of the most famous parishioners, Blanche K. Bruce. You can go to the next slide. Although Grimke transformed 15th Street Presbyterian into a vibrant center of civil rights and community activism, he also policed his parishioners' private lives, suspending women, for instance, for supposed impropriety, and publicly criticized working class and darker-skinned Black residents for their supposed shiftlessness and tendency to, quote, hang bare-armed out of windows and give the white citizens every reason to distrust us, end quote. Similarly, as consul to the Dominican Republic, Archie often referred to the Dominican peasants as, quote, incapable of self-government and, quote, in need of economic intervention from the Yankee businessmen. Here he sounds more like a racist white northerner overseeing the confiscation of freedmen's lands in the 1860s than a Black man dedicated to racial equality. Finally, there is the question of how the Grimke men treated the women in their lives, despite Archie's support for women's suffrage and Frank's public reputation for supporting the National Association of Colored Women. Frank married Charlotte Fortin, who of course was a 4th-generation Philadelphian and an intellectual and activist in her own right. But he discouraged her from continuing her public writing after the couple's first and only child, a daughter, died in infancy. Although privately devoted to Lottie and proud of her past accomplishments, Frank feared, as he put it, that, quote, the exposure of a pastor's wife could jeopardize the respectability of 15th Street Presbyterian. And so Lottie spent the last 4 years of her life as a, quote, colored society lady, supporting equally brilliant and publicly minded Black intellectual women like Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Turrell. Archie, meanwhile, raised his daughter Nana with every advantage that his money and political influence could buy. Yet his relentless criticism of Nana's passion for poetry and novels, of her supposed, quote, laziness in school, and particularly of her inappropriate relationships with women, meant that Nana Grimke grew up constantly failing to meet the requirements of a, quote, colored elite obsessed with racial respectability. You can go to the next slide. When Nana fell in love with a man, for instance, an attraction that Archie, Frank, and Lottie had constantly wished for, following Nana's unapologetic love for various female classmates, both Black and white, Archie threatened to cut her out of his life forever. The Black man, Archie insisted, was, quote, too dark, his work as a musician, quote, entirely unsuitable. The Grimkes, The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family, explores these complexities of what the scholar Saidiya Hartman calls slavery's afterlives, by asking questions that are as important today as we reap the effects of late-stage capitalism and the failed promises of the civil rights and Obama eras as they were in the Grimke brothers' time. How does the racial and sexual violence of Southern slavery continue to affect families, communities, and the ways in which Black people communicate with and understand our Blackness? What was the real cost of birthing a postbellum colored elite from the rampant sexual exploitation of enslaved Black women by slaveholding white men? And what does it mean that capitalist accumulation, supposed economic success, and professional achievement have never been enough to deliver us from America's racial abyss? Thank you, and I open it up for questions. We can leave, yes, there you go. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was just wonderful. So we have a good amount of time for questions. There are a few already in the chat. I have a few that I will take the liberty of starting with, and then as more questions trickle into the Q&A, I will transition to those. So please go ahead and continue to type questions into the Q&A, and I will take this chance to ask a couple questions. So for our significant audience that we have here, many of whom may have not yet read the book or your previous book, although many I know have, in the introduction, you described the subject of the book as the legacy of American enslavement and racial violence within families. Yes. So I'd love for you to expand a little bit. What drew you to this subject? Maybe share with the audience a little about your own trajectory into the Black past, as it were, and maybe the transition from your first book to your second.
Oh, well, thank you for the question. So I approached this book, or wanted to look at this book while I was writing the first book. So my first book was a biography of William Monroe Trotter. In that book, I really sought to situate New England, and Black New England in particular, as a center of Black radical politics, not just for the country, but across the African diaspora. And as I was doing the research for that book, I kept on coming across the Grimke family name. The relationship between Trotter and Archibald Grimke was a contentious one, as I go through in the first book. But I kept on coming across the Grimke family name, and all of the accounts I saw of them in the Black press and the white press really sort of exalted the Black Grimkes as being this example of what we now call kind of racial exceptionalism, that they were somehow these men who could do no wrong, that they were leaders, that they founded the NAACP, that they fought against lynching and all these things. And one of my approaches to all of those sources I saw was questioning why that was the kind of constant refrain. And so I began to do research on the family, and particularly I wanted to look at the public perception of the Grimkes versus the actuality. The second thing was that before I became an academic, I worked extensively in public history. So I worked for about 10 years as a historian with the National Park Service and with the Museum of African American History in Boston. And one of the things I was struck by with that job was the way that we talk in New England in particular about slavery and race in a way that demarcates those things as New England being either exceptional, right? That New Englanders somehow, the story goes, were all abolitionists and anti-slavery activists, right? Or New England being this horrible place, right? This is like the 1970s syndrome. We had busing in Boston, and Boston is this horribly racist place. And no place can be reduced to those two things. So my own trajectory as a scholar, seeing how that played out kind of in the public imagination, I really want to approach my own work as constantly interrogating those assumptions, specifically in New England, but just generally in terms of the stories we tell about communities. And so when I started doing research for the Grimke book in earnest, after the first book came out, I really wanted to touch upon this idea that of what I saw and what I continue to see as the family having these denials, like many families have, of where they actually came from, right? And many historians assuming that that was true, right? That somehow the enslaved Grimke men became these leaders, and they came from this experience in Charleston, and they had these wonderful aunts who supported them and brought them to the North, and that they were saved, right? And the more I read their letters and their diaries and their conversations with one another and with members of their community, I realized that the exploitation of their mother Nancy at the hands of the Grimke brother kind of weighed very heavily, as Angelina later put it, on everything that they talked about, right? And even how they talked about themselves in relation to other Black people. And so this very roundabout way of saying that I really saw that as a result of this what we now call racial trauma. But more importantly, I saw that trauma reflected in Angelina Weld Grimke's writings. All of her poetry, and for those of you who have read her work, deals with in some way, coding, things are not as they seem. She came out with a great poem called Tenebris, which is a play on kind of this allusion to the Bible, and the sword in the Bible being both a sign of angel and a sign of hell. And so she was always sort of exploring these themes. And I thought, if this woman's life was as bucolic, idealistic, and wonderful as kind of the public put it, why was she so sad, right? Why did she constantly worry that she was inflicting some type of damage on her family name? And so that's really how I came to it. So when you talk about it, this is in your own work, Kendra, on, families and silences and stuff, I really was interested in the contrast between the way this family talked about themselves, talked about their past, were very, very clear about what they understood about that past, versus the way that they portrayed themselves and thought about themselves in the public facing. And I wanted also to approach it not as being that this is somehow only a Grimke story, but it can often be the story of families and communities who are weighted down by their racial past.
Wonderful. Speaking of family, and we've talked, about your, the bulk of your scholarship being focused on Black New England. This book goes, of course, back and forth, between Charleston and DC and New England. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, region, like the kind of regional specificity, the local specificity, and how you think about, Black identities emerging in and across the nation at the multiple moments within this book. Or maybe might be interesting to hear. I know you actually are from Massachusetts, and you could talk a little bit about, how you came to understand, the Black world here in New England.
So it's a good question. So my family is very New England. My father's family is from Barbados. They migrated over different generations to Central Square in Cambridge, and were from Barbados and very rooted in that Caribbean community of Cambridge and Boston up until very recently, just in the past 5 years or so, when Cambridge is so expensive, and so they've moved out of that area. My mother was born in Boston, and her parents, my maternal grandparents, were very rooted in the region. My maternal grandmother grew up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Her father, so my great-grandfather, was a Black man who attended Dartmouth right after the Civil War and could not find a job anywhere despite having this Dartmouth degree in Shakespearean studies. And so knew kind of two aspects of New England, which was the brilliance of the educational system and intellectual stuff, but then the economic and racial segregation that made it hard to make a living, as he would say, as a thinking Black person. And so that background informs all of what I do, because it really wasn't until I entered college that I really realized that people had this idea that there are spaces where Black people don't live, right? And they don't live there, and therefore, if a Black person is from there, it's somehow exceptional. And I also really, when I sort of got that view of New England, which is different from how I was raised, it was a testament to my parents that they brought me up in kind of Black spaces throughout New England. So I spent summers coming out to the Berkshires as a kid. My godmother's family is from both Springfield and Pittsfield. And so when we would go out to visit her, we would often go, and I would meet people in, these places and Black communities. And so to me, it was not, it has never been a surprise that there's like a Black history there. My grandfather, who was from Virginia, he was a World War II veteran. He moved to Boston after the World War II, was also somebody who had, not beyond a high school education, but was very big on reading about Blackness in places, and would often take my sisters and myself and any other Black child, Black or white, who was in the neighborhood at the time. He'd put us in the back of his Cadillac and he'd just drive either on the Mass Turnpike West, or on Route 1, north and south, or Route 2. And he'd basically point out places where Black people were, right? Looking back on it now, I kind of realized his genius was that he read everything. So he would read about Black communities. And when he was in World War II, he met a lot of Black people from New England. And so he was the one who was like, Du Bois was from Great Barrington. This was the 80s when I was a kid, not to date myself. And, Du Bois was not embraced by the community. I remember that very, very clearly. Him trying to show us where he supposed Du Bois lived, and this was like the mid 80s, and somebody coming out and saying that Du Bois was a communist, and therefore, we shouldn't look at that building. And so I really think that informs the way I really want to see the complexities of place, right? And not assume that even me as a historian going into a place, that the story I think exists there is the one that actually is true. It also really made me think that, we have to bring in nuance and complexities to the stories we tell about Black communities, Black people, and Black stories, right? And so like the story of Black people in New England is not divorced from the history of enslavement and segregation and racial violence, but it also that all those things can manifest themselves in a very different way in New England, right? Black people, Black property holding men could vote in New England by 1790, right? So that means that somebody like a William Monroe Trotter, when he talked about the right to vote, he wasn't talking in the abstract. He was actually really talking about, we as Black men can vote in Massachusetts. We need to use that to pass legislation, right, in the early 1900s. Similarly, it would mean that somebody like a Charlotte Fortin, when she's traveling through Western Massachusetts in the 1850s, talked about the right of suffrage as a right that she saw Black men using in New England and not using it correctly. That was like her criticism, right? If you didn't kind of account for the fact that she's talking from a very particular space, that can seem like something different than it actually was. So I think that, I'm babbling on too much, but really, I really think that place, nuance, the idea of color, what did it mean, for instance, that Nana Grimke, for instance, the playwright and poet, had these really fond memories of New England and being there and being able, saw it as like a refuge, and didn't necessarily see that in DC, which is kind of the capital of the Black upper class, right? That kind of goes against the trajectory we've been told, and that doesn't mean that her story is any more true than somebody else's, but it gives sort of this nuance and flavor to Blackness and to communities that can often be missing from our historical analysis.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have quite a list of questions here. I'm going to start with one. We're very fortunate. We have Dolores Root and David Loving Lewis with us. And there's a question from Dolores. In what way did the descendants of the Grimke's interact with the Great Barrington community? Did Du Bois and the Grimke sisters interact? If we know, and tell us what or how.
Excellent. So I was one of the pleasures of being in the archive, wonderful archive at Howard University, Moreland Spingarn, was seeing the way that the Black Grimke brothers, as well as Charlotte Fortin before she became a Grimke, interacted with Black communities, particularly in New England. So the Grimke brothers, Archie and Frank, arrived in Massachusetts right after the Civil War. They initially were sent to work as apprentices in these white households in Rhode Island and outside of Boston. And then their mother, Nancy Weston, who, by the way, was could neither read nor write, found out that they were working and not going to school. And she basically begged white abolitionists to send them to school. And so the boys from that period on had a very positive relationship with New England and the Black community in New England. The only reason that Frank went to DC was because he went to Princeton Theological Seminary, and right when he graduated, he got the job as pastor in DC. But his plans were to move to Boston, where Archibald Grimke lived and was an attorney, and where he planned to raise his daughter Angelina. Their relationship, therefore, with the Black Berkshires was something that they talked about in their early letters. They talk about, and it's very frustrating because in the records, they refer to all these families like by their first initial. They stay with the B's out in Great Barrington. I don't want to assume those were some form of Burgarts, but they could have been anybody. They talk about an H family that lived in Pittsfield, who they used to visit. They talked a lot about being Charlotte Fortin Grimke, for instance, was very sickly throughout her life, and her being sent to these various water cure facilities. The most famous one before the Civil War was in Northampton, but there's evidence that many, and it was not segregated, so there were many members of the Black upper class who made their way there. And her talking about after going to this water cure, then being sent to this Black family in the Berkshires, right? And being able to partake of the mountain air. I so far have not been able to decipher who those people are. That's sort of a great project that can be done. But they talk constantly about staying with those people. Archibald Grimke also talked a lot about in the early 20th century of starting a branch of the American Negro Academy, which is the sort of intellectual group he helps found with Alexander Crummell, of wanting that group to do local history on Black descendants of the American Revolution, right? And him talking in these letters to other Black scholars about the fact that he knows of Black people in the Berkshires who want to tell their story about their family's history. So the Berkshires and Great Barrington in particular are kind of sprinkled throughout all of these letters. In the Grimke book, I did not get a chance to kind of include this as much as I would have liked to. But my next book project, who knows, I'll kind of focus more on that. We also know that Angelina Weld Grimke was a poet and playwright, very, very prolific. We know of her play Rachel, which was published in 1916, but by that point, she had already appeared in print beginning when she was 12 years old. She was sort of known as a favorite of local kind of salons and poetic circles in both New England and DC. Georgia Douglas Johnson called her a poet's poet, meaning that she kind of went around to these communities. And we know that one of the communities that she wrote in and found solace in was in Great Barrington. Again, it's frustrating because she doesn't name who the family she's staying with, which sort of shows us two things. One is that she kind of didn't think that this was, something that was notable, that she's going back and forth to these communities. And two, that perhaps the relationship between someone like Charlotte, the Black playwright, and Black communities expanded beyond, say, just DC and Harlem, that it had these little pockets. And I know that the Du Bois Freedom Center is doing a good job of kind of exploring that relationship between, say, what we call the Harlem Renaissance and these local Black communities. So yes, there's a lot of relationships between the two. Trotter, in my first book, had a branch of the African Blood Brotherhood, which I talk about in the first book, that was located in Pittsfield in the 1920s. And we also know that by the 1940s, a branch of Back to Africa movement was located and was looking at purchasing property in Great Barrington in the 1940s. So all of this, it is to point out, the importance of place, the importance of space, the fact that I could not possibly cover all this in this one book, but it kind of is sprinkled throughout all of the history of both this family and the Trotter family in my previous book.
Wonderful. So next question. Someone says, hi, I wonder about the portion of fame and status that the nephews had by being Grimke's. Was their stature due to the anti-slavery bona fides of their Grimke aunts, or was it due to the wealth and power of the slave-holding Grimke's?
So the Grimke brothers themselves were known for being part of this postbellum Black elite, or were on their way to being known as that before the Grimke sisters, quote unquote, discovered them in the newspaper. So the Grimke brothers were born in Charleston. Their mother was Nancy Weston. She was enslaved to Henry F. Grimke, the White Grimke sisters' brother. We know that they were enslaved and she was enslaved as well, but they were treated initially before Henry died in 1852 in sort of this a historian calls it kind of quasi-freedom. They were allowed to, Nancy, for instance, was allowed to nurse and care for her own sons. She was allowed to keep her own livestock and her own garden. So they considered themselves and they thought of themselves. And Nancy, and there's many other historians who have done a lot of research and talk about this in terms of women's studies and Black women's studies in particular. Nancy Weston raised her sons in, deep poverty, violence. This is all very described in the book, so I won't go into it here. Threat of racial and sexual assault. She raised them, however, to think of themselves as part of the Westons, who were, I go in this book, Nancy Weston was a member of this Black family that was, some of them were free and some of them were enslaved. So she raised her sons to think of themselves in that manner. And there are historians who talk about, as a Black parent, particularly during that time period, instilling in your children where you could that they were part of something bigger than where they were. So on one hand, that was very valuable because the Grimke brothers, when they, right at the beginning of the Civil War, when their white half-brother comes and tries to re-enslave them, or as he put it, teach them to be slaves, Frank and Archie were resistant. They ran away, they fought back, they were horribly abused by him, but they didn't think of themselves as being enslaved. So this instilled in them from their mother sort of this idea that they could go forward. The thing that allowed them to go forward eventually was that when they went to Lincoln University, their white aunts, again, I put in quotes, discovered them. They go to visit the boys at Lincoln University. They agreed to pay for the brothers' continued education. But as I talk about in the book, that caused a lot of issues between the brothers and their white relatives. So much so that Frank actually did not accept the sister's offer to pay for his education at Princeton. He said that they were basically compromising his position as a Black man, and therefore he would pay for it himself. Archie, however, had a very deep relationship with Theodore Weld, Angelina Grimke's husband. So I think to answer your question, the idea that they became a part of this upper class due to one or the other, either due to themselves or due to their ties to the white Grimke's. I think it's one of the things I try to complicate in the book, which is that this class, as it developed after the Civil War, was often connected to both. And yet it's at a period where the idea of class and color and family was shifting, right? The way Black people of the upper class in DC thought of themselves in 1880s was not the same as they thought of themselves in 1840s, right? And so the Grimke brothers, I would argue, are shaping the way that the Black community looked at class and color, even as they were being shaped by it.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, now we can.
Sorry. So that was great. So one person says, your book was wonderful. What was the thing that surprised you most? Or the most surprising thing you found during your research? And I'll fold in this next one. Has researching and writing this book uncovered other issues you didn't know you would find and might want to elaborate on or research next?
I think the biggest surprise to me was how much the family, the White Grimkes, talked about this intense violence in their household and in Charleston. And part of that might be because, you know, Sarah and Angelina became anti-slavery activists. So they talked about it in a different way. But even the members of their family, their siblings who were not anti-slavery, the way they talked so casually about the violence that occurred around them and that they watched each other inflict upon the enslaved. Again, my original training in grad school was not specifically in sort of studying enslavement. And so I had read of these things before, of course, but seeing just in one family how much over and over and over again, this sort of brutality was talked about in this callous way, right? And the fact that the Grimke sisters, in talking about that in their own anti-slavery work, couldn't kind of make the leap that they were benefiting from the economic and social and racial system that they talked about, right? There was never a recognition of that, even as many in their class and with their similar intellectual background would talk about that. Lucretia Mott, for instance, was an anti-slavery woman in Philadelphia. And in her work, she often talked about the fact that she had benefited from the slave trade. The Grimke sisters, there's not a lot of talk about that. It's sort of that slavery and slaveholding is harmful to white people in particular, that it is an evil, right? But there's no sort of recognition that they have benefited from it, that they, as a matter of fact, could have supported Nancy Weston in a different way. And so I think that was the most surprising, that just reading their letters, that was so blatant in all these, you know, hundreds of letters that are at the Clements Library.
Great. I'm going to read a couple additional questions here. Sarah says, I'm a big fan of Charlotte Forten and her journal. I'm wondering why it hasn't been reprinted and promoted widely. It's beautiful writing and so informative of that time on St. Helena Island. Have you heard of any plans to republish this amazing journal? And also adds, did Charlotte Forten use the nickname Lottie throughout her life?
Yes, so Charlotte Forten went by Lottie. That was because that emerged from childhood. So she grew up in Philadelphia, where her grandmother's name was Charlotte. The family called the grandmother Charlotte Sr., and they called her Lottie. And so that followed her throughout her life. Professionally, she referred to herself as Charlotte, that she was Lottie to everyone she knew. In terms of, you know, the publication of her journals, those have actually been published. There's a series that came out through Oxford University Press that Henry Louis Gates helped edit in the late 90s, early 2000s, that reprints works by African-American women. So they've actually were published, and that's actually how I was able to do my research, was that they're published. Those are not all of them, however. If you go into Moreland Spingarn at Howard University, all of the Grimke family's documents are located there, and actually Lottie Forten's, the published version of her diary, is sort of just part of what she actually ended up writing for herself and about herself in her last years of life.
Wonderful. Two more questions here. The first is about the Berkshires. How did the Black elite in Great Barrington during this era, as it were, relate to the overall Black community, or to Black communities more broadly?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things, and this is what hopefully my next book will be about, right? In the 19th century, of in the period that I have studied the most. So again, this could have changed, you know, beginning in the 1930s, 40s, or 50s. But the Black community was small enough in like Great Barrington and Lee and Lenox, and there was so much intermarriage and kinship relationships between the Black families in the area, that class was a big thing, was obviously a big thing. That sounds sort of naive, but yes, class was salient in these communities. And yet the community itself didn't demarcate until after the Civil War. And after the Civil War, there became a big demarcation between Black Southerners who arrived in Great Barrington and the region from the South, and the Black community that had been there or considered that they had been there longer, right? And so if you read the Black press, for instance, the New York Age, which was published in New York by T. Thomas Fortune, but Fortune had a column that was from the Berkshires, right? So he would have different Black communities be correspondents. He had for many years, the Berkshires were a correspondent with him. And the Black community talks about that tension between themselves and Black Southern migrants, or alternately Black Southern migrants and Black people who were native to the area. This changed over time. For instance, if you look at old issues of The Guardian, by the 1920s and 1930s, there's this sense amongst many Black readers, and particularly Black people who were native to or had lived in New England for a long time, that Great Barrington and Lenox and Lee were like these country places that Black people had lived for forever, but that class didn't really exist in there. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the case, but that means that that was the perception that many Black people had. It's definitely something that, for my next project, trying to dissect exactly what that meant in terms of class and the tensions within the Black community.
Wonderful. We have a question from David Lewis, who says, what of the fate of the third brother? He becomes almost déclassé. Why and how does he fall away?
Excellent question. So the Grimkes had a younger brother named John. John was born 3 months after the white slaveholding father, Henry, died. And John was still, a younger child when the Civil War began. So he was born in 1852. Civil War breaks out 1861. He's 8 or 9 years old at the time. When his older brothers went north to be educated, John remained in Charleston with their mother, Nancy, and actually lived with her in sort of the poverty conditions that she lived in Charleston with the end of the Civil War. She lived for a time inside the old slave mart. She and other Black women lived in there with their children at the end of the Civil War for a period of years. He eventually, however, the white Grimke sisters agreed to send him as well to Lincoln. And that's the only image that we have, if you saw the slides, of the three of them together that I've discovered. There could be more, but this is the only one I've discovered of him. The statement that the white Grimke sisters made about John, and this gets a lot into as I go into the book, the assumptions and the paternalism of the Grimke sisters, was that John somehow was not worthy. I haven't been able to discover why that was. Like, was there a definitive thing that happened? So far, I haven't been able to realize that. He was just as gifted, as intelligent as his brother from all that I could come across. He attended Lincoln. He did very well as a student, but after his first year, the Grimke sisters withdrew funding. So he, of course, could not pay for his education. He went and taught briefly at a Black school in Maryland, where he was beloved by that community. The few letters we have is that the Black community thought of him as being this great scholar and teacher, but he couldn't earn a living. And so he kind of, made his way throughout the North. There's evidence that in the 1880s, he shows up in New York City and tried to pass himself off as a member of kind of this Black elite. But then he's kind of mocked by the Black press, because when they discover that he's related to Archie and Frank, and that he himself is only a waiter, so there's talk in the Black press about him being, a ne'er-do-well and such. He then disappeared from from his brothers' kind of reckoning about themselves. The saddest thing was that when their mother Nancy died in 1895, John was living in Florida, and he wrote to Frank and Archie that he did not have the money to come from Florida to DC for the funeral, and that he had no money to contribute. And Frank's response was sort of very coldly, what's wrong with you? Why can't you get your act together? So John is really sort of a sadness and a hole within the lives of the Grimke brothers. Why was it that he was deemed by the white Grimke sisters as unworthy, right? And they actually used that term in their letters when they referred to him. And what did that do? That his brothers kind of got this financial support, and John himself was basically cut off from any of that, and then, was forced to sort of really make his own way in a way that his brothers were not. He died in 1915, and Angelina, his niece, Nana Grimke, the playwright poet, writes about never knowing her uncle and asking as a child, well, what happened to him? And everyone saying, we don't talk about him, right? We don't talk about Bruno, that the kids thing statement, that being the undercurrent was that nobody kind of talked about him or what happened to him. He worked as a waiter. I know he worked briefly as a teacher, but that's all that we know from the historical record.
Wonderful. I have one last question. You write really beautifully about historical memory or collective amnesia, as the case was, and the words you choose kind of evoke a kind of a haunting and a yearning, and that remains unfulfilled for many. And towards the end of the chapter on Archie, Frank, and John, you write, for the first time in nearly 14 years, Nancy Weston was there too, smiling for only the second time Frank had ever witnessed in his life. The next generation would bear the scars of her painful past, just as her sons bore them bravely at first, as they each sought from their wives all that Southern enslavement and the limitations of Northern liberalism denied them. So quite a lot of pressure on this thing we call the family.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could, this will be our final question here, just expand just a tiny bit about how you think about, intergenerational inheritance, and how these kind of traumas have shaped, continue to shape into the present.
Yeah, I think the Black people, communities, and families, I don't think have often been able to properly mourn and talk about the violence that's inherent in slavery and its aftermath. And particularly the Grimke brothers growing up and living through enslavement and then the period afterwards, there was really no way or place for them, at least as they saw it, for them to talk about their very real traumas, and the fact that those very real traumas, they were then expected to just kind of move on, right? And that if they didn't move on, the rhetoric surrounding that was that they had somehow failed and they were failing the race, right? And so I think that has a big legacy in the way that communities reckon with the racial violence traumas that can happen, right? If people aren't allowed to reckon with them or talk about them or talk about the very real consequences of, say, the failures of Reconstruction, what material effects does that have on people and communities and families, right? The fact that, James Forten, Charlotte Forten's grandfather, had a fortune, and yet given the limitations of institutional support for Black people and the realities of enslavement, he didn't have money when he died to pass on to his family, right? And so the legacies I see is that when families and communities are not allowed to properly mourn and really reckon with what has happened and the complex ways it has happened, right? That it looks different in Charleston than it did in Vicksburg, Mississippi, right? And aren't allowed to really talk about those nuances, then that it's doomed to be sort of passed on to the next generation.
Wonderful. I think that's such an important note to end on. I want to extend all of our gratitude, especially on behalf of the Du Bois Freedom Center, the board, and the staff. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. I'm going to make one last announcement. There is a book talk coming up. It is coming up on February 22nd at 6 p.m. with Chad Williams. This will be timed right around the time of Du Bois's birthday. This is in part a celebration of Chad Williams' latest book, which is about to come out on Du Bois and World War I, The Wounded World. I believe Zoe will post the information about that lecture and discussion into the chat now. So that should be a wonderful, also virtual talk with historian Chad Williams, exploring Du Bois's complex relationship with the history and legacy of World War I and what it reveals about the struggle for democracy, racial justice, and peace in the long 20th century. I also will give a quick preview or save the date. Looks like around July 7th, we will have a public event in connection with the Du Bois Freedom Center's Du Bois Forum, bringing together some writers and artists. And so that beautiful James Vandersea photograph that Dr. Greenidge shared at the beginning of the talk reminded me of that Lenox photo, because so much of the Harlem Renaissance, it was in DC with Angelina Grimke, was in the Berkshires with all sorts of writers, James Weldon Johnson, Sterling Brown, his papers are now at Williams, and of course, many, many more, including especially Du Bois. So thank you so much. A warm round of thanks, virtual thanks to our speaker tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at the next talk, February 22nd at 6 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you so much.